I'm a student, but what college and what I'm studying isn't important. What is important is that I've always owned Windows computers, and the school uses Macs for our projects. Transferring files between them was a nightmare, so I stayed at the school to finish anything due. I took the buses home every day and was fairly late. My school wasn't very far away from my place. However, I was always so tired from cramming to finish projects before the deadline that I took the bus home. And the passes were included in our tuition, so why not use it as often as possible? On the way back at night, I was nodding off to sleep. The driver's bad habit of stopping suddenly was the only thing keeping me awake. My head snapped forward when the bus stopped. At first, I wasn't sure where I was. We stopped in front of a park. The driver often paused to take a 5-minute break at this stop because I was the only one left riding the bus. I knew I would drift back off to sleep if we didn't start moving soon. I almost did. Glancing out the window, I noticed something that got enough of my attention to stay awake. A man was just walking under a light and into the park. For a split second, I saw his face, but I couldn't remember what it looked like. My body reacted in flight mode after seeing it. I was wide awake, feeling like I should start running, muscles tense. I started hoping he looked back towards me. I burned the rest of his image into my mind due to how small the smallest hint of seeing his face screamed danger. He looked normal, tall and thin, and dressed in a maroon suit. Alright, maybe that colour of suit wasn't all that normal. I'd seen weirder outfits on the students in my class, and there were some bars in the area. It wasn't unreasonable that he wore his nice suit out on a date. I could explain his fashion sense, but not why my body reacted in the way it did, only looking at him. The bus started back up again, and I was left to wonder what that was all about for another day. While I was working on my newest project, I kept getting distracted thinking about that man in the park. I wanted to remember his face just as much as I didn't. I knew unless I got this settled, I would never be able to focus. The path through the park was faster than the bus. I always stayed on the bus instead of cutting through because I was too lazy to walk. The next night, I got off the bus right in front of the park. My driver paid no attention. It was a foolish thought, thinking that the odd man would be back a second time, and I haven't heard great things about that park. A lot of muggings lately, so all of my female friends refused to walk through at night. Dangerous, but I still just needed to know who that man was. I walked through at a brisk pace while looking around me. I kept my phone in my hand in case I did get into trouble. When I came across someone on the pathway, I eyed him wary. When he spotted me and took a few steps in my direction, I almost called the cops. Relief flooded me when his jacket was labelled with security. "Hey, can I walk you through?" he offered, and stopped a few steps in front of me, in case I was still a bit untrusting. "Parks have security now?" I asked, eyebrows raised. He let out a chuckle at my question. "Yeah, the city hired my company for a few weeks. There have been attacks and not enough officers to patrol. Until they get settled, they want someone to scare away the muggers and get the drunks to the other side safely." That did make some sense. A few cops just retired out, leaving so many spots to fill. I heard about the issue, but never about how it would affect the city as a whole. "I'm Garrett. You don't need to walk with me if you feel uncomfortable. Just thought I would offer. I can take down anyone who tries to hurt you, but can't arrest them," he explained. Since he seemed like a nice enough guy, I took him up on his offer. I couldn't ask him about the odd man I'd seen before, so I let him talk about his job for a few minutes until I was out of the park. I thought if we spoke enough, the topic would come up naturally. It didn't by the time I was on the other side. I thanked him by asking if he was going to be on the same shift tomorrow. He was. At least now there was someone to watch over me as I went on this goose chase of mine. In the next week, I took my path through the park with Garrett beside me. He kept warning me to stay on the bus, but I could also tell he wanted someone to chat with. It was a boring job after all. I didn't have class on the weekend, so I didn't see him for 2 days. The following Monday, I was a little shocked at what I saw when we met at the usual time. Garrett was a tall, built man. You needed to be for his line of work. He said he was in the military, but due to a leg injury, he needed to retire early. so it was a surprise to see him with a busted lip and a black eye. "Garrett, are you alright?" I asked my new friend. "Yeah, it's nothing. Some kids get rowdy over the weekend. Needed to break it up. They scattered, but I feel like they're bad news. It's better if you stay at the park for a few days. You hear?" I nodded, feeling a little upset that he got roughed up. Must have been a bunch of people to do it. My quest of trying to find a stranger should not put me in danger. For all I knew, I dreamed that man with a strange face. We walked and talked. Garrett was happy there was someone to listen to him speak after 2 days of being alone. "You'll stay away for a little bit, right?" he asked when we reached the other side of the park. "Yeah, for a few days, but you better be here when I get back," I was warned. He gave me another smile, and we went our separate ways. I fully planned on staying on the bus instead of cutting through for a while, and I did just that for 2 days. On the third, I was on the idling bus waiting for it to get going when I saw something going on at the entrance of the park. A group of high school students were cheering and walking into the start of the trail. It was nothing out of the ordinary. That was until I noticed some carried baseball bats. It took my mind a few moments to register they were not just coming home from practice. By the time I did, the bus had started to drive again. I rushed to the front of the bus, begging it to stop. The driver looked annoyed until I explained my theory. He agreed to call the police for me due to how worried I looked. The city buses always opened the doors when they stopped. The driver didn't have time to stop me from running out the door and towards the park. It wasn't the wisest idea. I still felt as if I could find Garrett before those kids. I wasn't about to leave my first real friend. My entire life, I kept my head down, not speaking much. I just found someone who liked a person that listened. I wasn't going to let that happen to him. I ran in the dark, chest hurting from not even doing a light jog in years. I heard the sounds of the kids cheering each other on, and I prayed I wasn't too late. I almost ran into one of them. They all stood in a circle, already finding my friend. He was tough, but against a pack of teens with weapons, I could tell a few of them were on the receiving end of his punches before they overpowered the single park security guard. I felt sick when I heard the bat crack against something. I didn't think I took so long finding them, and yet I was far too late. A boiling rage I've never felt before overtook me. I stepped away from the group before anyone noticed me. "Hey, shitbags! The cops are on the way, so you better fuck off!" I was a small college student. I may have a few years on these kids, but every single one of them were taller and stronger than me. Some turned their heads and laughed at my poor attempt at being intimidating. "Oh, then we better finish this up soon," one near the middle replied with a horrible laugh. He raised a bat to bring it down on my friend, hidden between them all. I stood, mouth open, unable to do anything. I couldn't even let out a scream to help my friend. By some miracle, he stopped. All of them did. Confusion plastered over their faces as they looked towards me. No, behind me. "Who the hell are—" one of the teens started, but stopping as his voice trailed off into a choking sound. I didn't turn around to see what they were all looking at. I watched all their faces turn from confused to pure horror. Faces pale, some gagged, and others choked. Their weapons clattered to the ground as each of their mental states disintegrated in front of me. A few stood completely silent and wide-eyed as blood started to come from their nose. As they collapsed to the ground, I could see Garrett curled up protecting his head. I wasn't sure how badly he was hurt. I wanted to go over to him, but first I needed to know what was behind me. I turned to face the man in the suit that led me into the park to start with. He stood under a light a step away from me. If he had eyes, he would be looking down on me. Instead of a face, there was nothing. Just a void of black. At first it was a simple void. Then the longer I looked at it, I started to see shapes shifting and twisting. Shapes no word has ever been created to describe. My head pounded, but I couldn't look away. I've never been so scared before in my life. I don't know how my heart didn't stop right then and there. The world shifted around me to make it feel like I was no longer standing still, as if everything was shaking and yet not at the same time. Out of the void, these colours and shapes not meant for human eyes came towards me endlessly. I was vaguely away from my own nose bleeding, and my fingers twitching from the horror that should not be a part of this world. Time had no meaning as that void of nothing, and yet everything stretched out before me. I looked for so long. I saw something I shouldn't have seen, a hint of this creature's real face. The smallest of glances of that face made my heart beat, and I was snapped out of my trance the void brought me into. My head hurt, and my nose was bleeding still, but besides that, I was fine compared to the teens behind me. The man had his hand in his pocket, and when I started to dab my nose on my sleeve, he reached out for me. Without being able to stop myself, I reached out and took his hand. The shapes and colours still swirled around the void of her face, making me dizzy, but I could stand it. I was feeling a stronger emotion than fear. I was still scared out of my wits, but light-headed from the sudden fluttering in my stomach. "Are you single?" I wanted to scream. All movement around the void stopped. The man looked stiff and somehow, without a face, embarrassed. I couldn't believe I just asked out a nightmare creature. What was wrong with me? No, really. What was wrong with my brain? Until that point in my life, I'd never experienced any sort of romantic love towards anyone. My mother always said I just needed to meet the right person. I fully accepted living alone. I didn't mind it. I was perfectly content doing my own thing until that moment. I wanted Garrett to be alright and to be my friend, and I desperately wanted to date this monster. He moved his head so he was looking at the group of traumatized teens and then back towards me. "Sarah ugly?" the man without a face asked. His voice sounded like clips of other voices making up a word. I felt my face flush as I nodded. Who knew being scared to death and love at first sight could happen at the same time? I mean, I know it's sudden, and it's fine if you aren't. I'm okay being friends or just hanging out and getting to know you. So I'm just going to get my friend to the hospital. What do you think about it? And I'll see you tomorrow night. I wanted to die for a few different reasons. I let go of the faceless man's hand to go over to my other friend. The man looked at his hand as if trying to figure out what just happened. Garrett was already waking up and trying to move. I told him to stay put and I called for help. When I looked back up, the faceless man was gone. Garrett would be in the hospital for a bit, but he was alive. He kept thanking me for saving him, even though I felt like I didn't do much. And he was also angry at me for rushing in to save him. I would never hear the end of how proud and disappointed he was in me. The cops gathered up the teens, and the last I heard, they blamed their mental damage on a bad batch of drugs. I didn't know if it was a cover-up job, or they just wanted to close the case. I was certain I would never really learn the truth. I kept my promise and went back to the park to meet the monster that saved us. After a few hours, I didn't think he would show up. When he did, I felt dizzy again looking into the void. I got thinking about why I was able to stand looking into his face and others couldn't. "Hang out?" he asked in his weird voice when he stopped in front of me. I felt my stomach flutter again, glad he was fine, with getting to know each other, and forgiving me for my outburst the other night. I decided then on why I could look at his face. Because I loved him more than I was afraid of him. That worried me. I knew if my feelings ever changed, it might turn out like those teenagers. The faceless man didn't appear to have any kind of malice behind his actions. He was just a little bit dangerous by existing. I was strangely enough perfectly fine with that. He didn't talk much. I started to show him some videos on my phone he appeared to enjoy. It was hard to tell with him. For now, I'm pretty happy with how things are. Just hanging out with the faceless man in the park until I'm ready to ask him if he wanted to take it further. I have a new next-door neighbour. I met him when I was waiting for the elevator in my apartment building. The building I live in is a rundown piece of crap. However, it was the only place I could afford. My apartment was on the 4th floor, and the elevator was broken more often than it worked. I was just getting back from the grocery store, arms full of bags, when I left the damn elevator was working, so I stood in front of it for at least 5 minutes, expecting the doors to open. My rage was about to boil over, and I raised a foot ready to kick the door in frustration. I was tired, arms sore, and I didn't want to take the stairs. I stopped because someone reached over to press the button, to get no response. I'd never seen him before. He was a head taller than myself and in good shape. His hair was neat and grey, even though he only looked 30 at the most. My building was full of poor families and some drug addicts. He looked as if he didn't belong. Well, in a way. He didn't look like he lived there, but he looked like the type of guy who came around looking for someone who owed money. I lowered my foot, taking a few steps away from him, not wanting to be too close. I knew my place in the food chain, and it was below him. He looked over at me when I moved, his grey eyes staring me down. I felt sweat start at the back of my neck from his intense gaze. I started to feel like I was going to puke from stress when he jerked a thumb at the still closed doors. Broken? He asked me. He had a hint of an accent I couldn't place. I let myself exhale a breath I didn't know I was holding. I nodded my head, still not ready to speak. He looked around the lobby and found the stairs. Because of so many break-ins, the landlord locked the stairway to the upper floors, but hadn't found a way to lock people out from accessing the apartment floors with the elevator if they got through the lobby first. With it being broken so often, he didn't need to bother. The man took out a key to open the stairway. To my surprise, he held the door open for me. I scurried along, carrying my heavy bags, trying to pass him as fast as possible. I went up the stairs first, but slowly, he should have been able to pass me without any trouble. The man stayed behind a few steps, and it stressed me out again. I was rather thankful he did. On the second flight of stairs, I felt the handle of my bag snap. I nearly dropped everything trying to catch it, and ended up falling backwards a step or two. Not only did the stranger catch me with one hand, he caught my carton of eggs with his other. I stammered out an apology as my bag of oranges broke and tumbled down the stairs. He looked like the type to get angry. Instead, he just shook his head and helped me back on my feet. Silly boy, I will help. That time, I caught a Russian accent when he spoke. One he was poorly trying to hide. The next few minutes, we both started to gather up the spilled oranges from the stairway. He tied the bag, but didn't hand it back to me. Silently, he was telling me he would carry the broken bag of food and my carton of eggs to my apartment, because I could not be trusted. My face was red from embarrassment. People never helped me out, and I didn't know how to deal with it. I just muttered out another thanks and let him follow me to the 4th floor. When I stopped in front of my door, he did a double take at the number. You here? I'm there, he said, pointing to the door next to mine. I knew my neighbour moved out last week. I didn't hear anyone move in since and wondered when he arrived. Oh, I didn't hear you move in, I commented, thinking I would at least have seen him before now if we lived next to each other. Not much to move. We stood looking at each other a bit awkward and both unsure of what else to say. Normally, I was more outgoing than this. For some reason, this man just threw me off. I opened my door and placed the bags down inside so I could accept the items he was still carrying for me. Tell me your name. It sounded like a demand, and I stuttered for a few seconds. Richie. I mentally kicked myself after I spoke. No one called me Richie. I had no idea why that came to mind. Not even my mother shortened my name. Nice to meet you, Mr. It was far too late to correct myself and tell him my name was really Richard. I just asked for his name instead. He froze, looking like a club bouncer who was about to toss out a drunk. I felt like I just made a big mistake. Clearing his throat, I flinched. Dimitri, he said finally. I had a feeling it was a fake name, just the first one that came to mind. With the kinds of people who lived in this building, I didn't blame him for not wanting anyone to know who he really was. I gave him a smile I hoped didn't look strained. Thank you for helping me, Mr. Dimitri. He was older than myself, but not that much older to call him Mister. He gave me a stiff nod and left me to go inside his apartment. I went back inside and mentally screamed the entire time I put my groceries away. I didn't have an explanation for why I was acting so weird around my next door neighbour. There was just something off about him. I needed to put the weird feeling I got out of my mind. After all, he was nice enough to help me out. I should treat him a bit better the next time I see him. The strangeness with Dimitri kept going. The next day, I was awoken by a knock on my door. I never got visitors and was wary of who it could be. I almost stayed in bed and ignored the knocking, but my curiosity got the better of me. Keeping the chain on my door, I opened it enough to see my new neighbour waiting for me to open the door. I pushed down the stressed feeling in my guts and opened it a bit more. Is everything all right? I didn't have a clue what he could need me for. Maybe there was something wrong in his apartment and we couldn't get a hold of our landlord. Give me your work time, Dimitri demanded, and it made me confused on what he meant for a few seconds. After thinking, I realised he wanted my work schedule. I didn't have the set shifts, rather worked whatever they needed for me that week. It's on my phone. Do you want me to get your number and I can text you when I'll be at work? I asked. He nodded, and I went back inside to retrieve my phone. It looked like a cheap burner phone when he pulled it from his pocket so we could exchange numbers. After I sent the text, he nodded, looking my hours over. I suddenly regretted it. It looked like he was planning on using this information for nefarious purposes. I was really just overthinking. I work at home. Very loud. Only when you are not home. With that vague explanation, he left me standing in my PJs, door open, and trying to make sense of what he just said. Whatever he did for work, he didn't want to disturb me, but also didn't want me hearing anything. That would mean he was into some adult work, or something illegal. He looked more like the mob type, and I leaned more towards that. The first week, I didn't hear a peep from Dimitri's apartment. He was keeping to his promise of not disturbing me with whatever job this was. I saw brief glimpses of him when I was coming back home from work, and he was leaving his apartment. He always had a large bag over one shoulder and wore black leather gloves. I didn't see a motorcycle in the parking lot and wondered if he rode one. When we saw each other, he would give me a curt nod in acknowledgement. I thought that was how we would treat each other, not speaking and just giving a neighbourly nod. He did help me, but he also had a dangerous air about him. Even the addicts that hung around the front of the building gave him space when he walked near them. The second time we spoke was because he broke into my apartment. For a good reason that wasn't entirely my fault. I'm starting to wonder if I'm clumsy or just have bad luck. I put a bottle of aspirin on top of the fridge. While I was getting things out to start making dinner, I felt a headache slowly creep its way through my brain. I reached for the bottle of aspirins only to knock them over. It rolled further back and out of reach. Instead of finding my step stool, I climbed upon the kitchen counter, one arm resting my weight on the cupboard and the other reaching for the bottle. I heard a soft creaking the second everything came tumbling down. My shoddy cupboards were not nailed into the wall properly. Unable to support my weight, it came off the wall, smashing against my head and spilling its contents on the way down. I felt blood starting to pour from the cut in my forehead, and all the air was knocked from my lungs when I fell onto the floor, with the cupboard on top of my chest. Without any doubt, the crashing sound of plates and cup breaking would have been heard in the apartments next to mine. I needed to recover before worrying about apologising for the noise. I stayed down on the floor, head pounding for a while. I felt sick and dizzy from the pain. My cell phone on the counter was out of reach. I could only hope that the cut was minor. I couldn't afford a trip to the hospital. Richie? I looked up, the movement killing my head. Dimitri stood in my kitchen doorway, looking down at me. I locked my apartment, so how did he get in? I stopped speaking because the pain was so great. I really didn't need to explain what happened. It was pretty obvious. He bent over and pushed the cupboard off and crushed glass under his feet while he walked. He easily lifted me off the ground and helped me out of the room, avoiding broken shards on the floor. Using a dish towel, he cleaned some blood off my forehead and face. I was not in any state to stop him or even question what he was doing there. I would call the doctor, Dimitri said, and pulled his phone from his pocket. You look like a different one than before. I opened my mouth to protest, but one look from his steel grey eyes was enough to shut me up. I sat, holding a damp towel on my head as he spoke to a doctor on the other end of the phone. 10 minutes, he announced after he hung up the phone. How did you get in? I finally asked. Lockpick. He did look like the type to know how to pick locks. For the next 10 minutes, he was trying to keep me sitting down as he started to clean up the mess I made. Head wounds bleed a lot. It looked like a murder happened in my kitchen, and I felt like I would never get the blood out of my cheap tile flooring. The doctor arrived, and Dimitri let him in. The man pulled up a chair in front of me to get a look at my cut. He set down a bag on the table next to us. He looked like a doctor from the 1800s. His glasses were round, gold-rimmed. He was dressed in a vest with a button-up shirt underneath. His black hair styled perfectly back in the same way every man in the 1950s wore it. He took a penlight out from his bed, so at least his tools weren't old-fashioned. He shone it in my eyes and made me follow it. No brain damage, so that's good. Just a lot of blood and a minor cut. Dimitri could have dealt with this himself, but I suppose he wanted to make sure your brains weren't scrambled. The man introduced himself as Dr. Philo before sitting down and looking me over. His tone was stern, but somewhat fatherly. I'm sorry to bring you over here. I'm sure this is out of your way and I could have gone to the hospital, I said, suddenly feeling embarrassed. Making house calls is part of my job. A lot of my patients can't make it to my clinic for various reasons. I watched as he fully cleaned the cut and started to stitch it up without giving me any warning. It was only 3 stitches, but it still hurt. Noise came from the kitchen as Dimitri cleaned up the carnage that was once my dishes. He's an alright guy, even if he looks pretty scary. I kept talking, trying to distract myself from the pain. He doesn't look like the type to help out like this. I think he just doesn't want to move again. If you look past what kinds of people live in this area, then this place is pretty good. Cheap rent and close to everything you need, the doctor explained. When the cut was dealt with, he put his tools back into his leather bag. When the tools were put away, he took out a thermos and a box of cookies. I recognized the store name. I could never afford to buy anything from the bakery they came from. It was very popular and way beyond my budget. He poured a small cup of tea that smelled like flowers. I've never seen a kind of tea that smelled that sweet and was a pink colour before. Here, drink a little of this and eat something. I have a pill to help you with the pain, but you need to have something in your stomach first. My head did hurt, but it was manageable. I didn't want to give my brother extra medicine if I could help it. Trying to get some aspirin got me in the mess to start with. No, it's fine. It was not fine. Dr. Philo sat, glaring me down, with the thermos lid of tea still in his hand for me to take it. I realised how rude I was being. He brought very expensive tea and cookies, and I was refusing them. The cookies were the best I've ever had, and the tea was as sweet as it smelled, but not overpowering sweetness. I wanted to ask what brand, but I feared I would also be out of my budget. I sat sipping away, feeling a bit embarrassed again. I had 2 strangers in my apartment because I didn't just go and find something stable to stand on. I would need to think of something to do for Dimitri to thank him for this. When I finished a few cookies, the doctor gave me a pill to take. I should have been a bit more wary of taking pills from strangers. After all, I didn't actually know Dimitri. I trusted him and the doctor without a second thought. You're going to be asleep for a few hours. If you're working tomorrow, cancel your shift to rest. I'll write you a note if you need one. I opened my mouth to argue, but that was my last memory of that night. I woke up in the morning, head heavy, and very confused on how I'd got to bed. My bloody shirt was missing and I was wearing a clean one. I sat up, looking around, trying to recall anything from that night beyond talking with the doctor. When nothing came to mind, I walked out into the kitchen to see the damage. And saw nothing. Not even a speck of blood on the floor. New cupboards were installed on the walls, and I tried to shake them to see if they were fastened tight this time. I was still missing most of my plates and cups, but I wondered how I slept through someone coming inside the kitchen and replacing the cupboards. I called my boss, telling them I wouldn't be there that day. I felt fine though, not even a trace of a headache. It was the best sleep I've had in months. My boss told me someone already arranged for me to take the day off. He hung up and didn't elaborate further. My job was very against someone calling in for another person. You could be in a coma, but still expected to be the one calling in. I wonder what kind of strings Dimitri pulled to get me the day off. I didn't know when he worked and what times he was home. I went next door and knocked, hoping he would be in so I could thank him. I could have just sent him a text, but I felt as if it should be in person. The door opened and he looked down on me. His cold expression never changes. Thank you for helping me out. Did you ask the landlord to replace my cupboards? I said. No, I did. Woodworking is a hobby. Overnight, this man built an entire set of cupboards for a stranger. I tried taking a peek into his apartment. It looked like an identical I set up to mine. His hallway had plastic sheets covering the floor, which made sense because he was in the middle of painting. Near the doorway were splashes of dried brown stains along the baseboard he had yet to cover up. I was about to ask him about his renovation plans when he reached out and lightly touched the stitched-up cut on my forehead. This is going to scar. Oh, I said, adding nothing useful to the conversation. Oh. The second explanation was because I finally clued into why someone who looked so threatening went out of his way to help me out. My face flushed and I froze, trying to dismiss the thought. He was just a nice guy, that was all. I would be full of myself to ever think he was interested in me in any way beyond being a friendly neighbour. I stood, staring at him, looking like a deer in a pair of headlights. I'll make you dinner, as a thank you, I stuttered. Mentally, I was screaming at myself because I was making this entire exchange even more awkward. Dimitri kept his stone-cold expression on his face, not looking to notice my panic. Do you like dogs? The question was so out of the blue, it made me pause. Yes? I'll make you a dog. Go rest, I need to work. Without any further explanation, Dimitri went back inside his apartment and closed the door. I did pull him away from painting, so I didn't think of him suddenly ending the conversation as rude. Trying to think what his last statement meant would drive me crazy. I went back into my place, having a few things to think over. First, I needed to figure out what my next-door neighbour would eat. He didn't seem to be the type to be picky. The dog comments I figured out. He said woodworking was his hobby, so maybe he was going to make me a dog out of wood. But why? Just because he was extra material around? The last thought I was doing my best to push from my mind. I did everything not to think about it. It kept creeping at the edge of my thoughts, and I finally needed to admit defeat. I snapped while staring at pasta boiling in a pot, completely mortified over the idea my neighbour might like me. Like, really like me. I've never been interested in guys before. The problem was, I'd never been interested in girls either. I just assumed those feelings would come along when I saw the right woman. Never would have expected to find myself making dinner for my male neighbour. By the time I finished dinner and had it packed up to go next door, I came to terms with the facts. Dimitri might be romantically interested in me, or just a nice guy under his cold tone. In our short interactions, I had fallen for him and was very determined to not do anything about it. I chalked it up to me being just starved for attention. I lacked any friends, and due to some long dramatic family history, I was not in contact with any of them. In fact, I never really had any close friends. I might just be getting my signals crossed on how I felt due to lack of experience. I brought the still hot pasta over next door and knocked, feeling like I wanted to make a run for it. When the door opened again, I jumped. Unable to say anything, I held out the containers of food. Many thanks. I washed these. Bring back later, Dimitri said with a nod, taking them from me. He sounded as if he was trying his best to hide his accent, as if he didn't want me to know where he was from. They're just plastic. You can keep them if you want, I told him, with a shake of my head. I now had more plastic Tupperware than real dishes. I washed them. Here is a dog for you. Placing the containers on a table just inside the door, Dimitri picked up a small wooden figure. I held out my hand to take it from him. It was a goofy-looking pug carved from wood. Honestly, the detail to the wrinkles were impressive. I thanked him again and realised every time we met I always had something to thank him for. In his cold manner, he shooed me away. Go rest, I'll work. Again, the door was shut in my face without me minding in the slightest. The next few weeks, I made a habit of bringing dinner over to my neighbour, and on occasion, he made small dogs to add to my growing collection. Our exchanges were brief, and I didn't learn anything new about him, aside from the fact he was really slow at painting. Every time he opened the door to his apartment, I could see his floor still covered with plastic. My shifts at work became more regular. Instead of just coming in when needed, I had a set schedule. It meant I could budget my finances better. If I saved, I could move into a better area or town or closer to my job. I wasn't sure if I really wanted to move just yet, and decided to just keep saving money to think about it in the future. Feeding a second person wasn't really an issue, because it was just cheaper to buy food in bulk to start with. I was feeling getting into a routine, and my life finally felt like it was turning around after years of struggling. I made a friend, even if he was a bit strange and had a steady job. Things might have worked out fine if my job didn't give me a surprise day off. A pipe burst in the restaurant, so they needed to close over the weekend to fix it and get everything cleaned up. I never got Fridays off and was at a loss of what to do. Dimitri wasn't expecting me to be home or get dinner that night. I had enough rice to make a curry for two, so I decided to drop some regardless of whether he was expecting or not. I heard Dimitri's voice from outside, so I knew he was just getting home. I thought I heard another person. Just as I was putting the curry into a container to bring it over, I heard a loud thud from his place and I jumped. I strained listening, trying to figure out what the source of the sound was. I stood as still as possible, trying to hear something over my beating chest. The next sound was muffled, but I could have sworn I heard a scream. On reflex, I grabbed the containers of food. I rushed over, not even bothering to close my door. Outside of his apartment, I slipped in some liquid and my heart sank when I saw it looked like a lot of blood. I was in a panic when I noticed the door wasn't closed all the way. Dimitri looked as if he could handle himself, but all of these were bad signs. Without even thinking, I rushed inside his place, still holding the hot containers. My feet slipped again on the plastic covering the floors, but I froze when I saw what I just stumbled into. My brain would just not register what I was seeing for a few moments. I knew I was looking at Dimitri from his frame, but not by his face. I only saw it for a few seconds, but the images burned into my memory. His face was split open horizontally. Thousands of needle-like teeth along the slit of a mouth glimmered in the dim light of his apartment. His eyes warped and twisted from the monstrous face locked onto me. The terrifying mouth closed in seconds after we made eye contact. His face returned to normal, but with his mouth slightly open at a loss for words. The other person in the room looked equally as shocked. The other man was on his knees, Dimitri pulling his head back by his short hair to expose his neck with a large hunting knife to his throat. The knife was serrated and made for killing. Besides them, a different man was on the floor face down, fresh blood still pooling around him and over the plastic. "You don't work tonight?" Dimitri asked, breaking the silence. The man with the knife to his neck said nothing. His eyes wide and pleading, I couldn't bring myself to look at him for more than a few seconds. The smell of fresh blood was in the air, making me feel sick. The heat from the containers started to hurt my hands, but I didn't dare move. Knowing I couldn't answer his first question, Dimitri nodded his head towards the hot curry containers. "What have you got?" he slowly asked. "Curry. Enough for two." I normally gave him enough for 2 meals because he was a bigger guy than myself. I always assumed he ate more. Even while I spoke my mind, screamed at me to run. Then my kind neighbour just killed a man, and he was going to kill another if I hadn't stopped him. I dreaded that I was going to be next. I'd seen what happened and needed to be taken care of. All the hints I'd brushed off came crashing down in my mind. The sketchy door, how easy the cold, clean blood from my floor, the plastic sheets and never the smell of paint. How often he moved. Everything was staring at me in the face, but I was so desperate for a friend, I ignored all the red flags. I held back a noise of fear when Dmitri let go of the man and pushed him aside. In a few steps, he was in front of me, his tall figure looming. The knife was still in his hand, but pointed down. I knew if he wanted, he could kill me in a blink of an eye. I flinched, a small sound escaping me when it raised a hand and ran a thumb over where my stitches had been. Did not scar badly. Getting down on my level, he leaned over so his face was close to my own. I felt my muscles turn to stone as I looked into the steel grey eyes. Eyes of a killer looking me over, deciding my fate. My hands started to shake and I almost dropped the food. Dmitri placed a hand on top to steady the containers. I was so convinced I was going to die, I nearly passed out. Still friends? His voice was low and had a hint of worry in it. My heart was so loud I nearly didn't hear him. Friends? He wanted to know if I was still going to act friendly around him? I risked a look over his shoulder at the man who looked as scared as I was. I made my choice. I nodded. If I kept my mouth shut, I would live. After he nodded, he took the curry from my hands and stood up. You, table, we eat dinner. Richie, best to go back home. He didn't need to tell me twice. Without looking back, I turned on my heels and left. I made sure the door was fully closed behind me and kept my eyes straight, not looking down at the blood still in the hallway. I took off my now blood-stained socks and threw them in the trash without any hesitation. My cell phone sat on the counter. I looked on it, debating on what I wanted to do. I should call the cops. I witnessed a murder. My next neighbour killed someone. Without any doubt, he had done it before, and he would keep doing it unless he was arrested and stopped. I couldn't believe the supernatural aspect of what I saw. I could believe in murder, but not split-faced monsters. My hand hovered over the phone as I repeated the facts inside my head. I let out a yell of frustration and walked away from my phone. I paced around my apartment for hours. The portion of curry I saved for myself got cold in the stove. Every time I got close to calling the cops, I just couldn't bring myself to go through with it. After a while, I heard a knock on my door and all the fear came rushing back. It could only be one person. He knew I was home, so no sense in trying to hide from him. Cautiously, I opened my door. To my shock, the man who Dmitri was about to kill when I walked in was still alive. His face was bruised, but he was breathing. We wanted to thank you for dinner. My friend will be leaving. The man gave me a nod, his face pale and hands shaking it aside. Still friends? Dmitri asked you again. Still friends, I confirmed with a small nod. That was enough for him. He took the man by his arm and dragged him down the hallway. He was going to let him go free, or kill him somewhere else. It was a mystery. I would never know the answer. I never ended up calling the police or telling anyone what I saw. I saw Dmitri a few times in the hallway in passing, but face looked strained. He knew I wasn't going to get him arrested. It was far too late by now. He would have covered his tracks, and I doubted the cops would take me seriously. Any normal person would have done the right thing and gone to the cops right away. I felt pretty guilty for not doing so. Instead of moving or suggesting to Dmitri that he should leave, I did something I don't regret. I brought over another meal for him. His face was a bit shocked to see me knocking on his door with a smile on my face and food in my hands. We were still friends after all, and I was going to treat him almost the same as I did before. Gathering up the courage, I offered him the food and asked for something I'd wanted for a while. Do you want to eat together? He nodded his head, this time the one being unsure of what to say. My neighbour is a killer, and well, something not human if those few seconds of memories are real. But oddly enough, I really don't mind. I've been pretty lonely for years, and eating a meal with someone is something I desperately want. Murderer or not, human or not. At least he was nice enough to sit and eat with me as I talked about my day. When I was younger, something happened that made me fear thunderstorms, even into adulthood. Something that my parents are certain was a dream. But with the rash of missing pets and now 2 children, I feel as if I should write that down to warn people, even if no one believes me. I was around 10, and my family pooled money together to rent a cabin by the lake. All my aunts and uncles and cousins shared it. It was rather crowded, but I really didn't mind. At first, it was the best 2 weeks of my life. We could just run down into the lake whenever we wanted. We went fishing from the docks, but for some reason, my favourite pastime was collecting freshwater mussels. I wasn't sure of the type of mussels, but the locals hated them. Apparently, they were a new invasive species and did a great deal of ecological damage. So, they encouraged us kids to pull them from the lake in buckets. Every day, we collected them from the little lake beach we had in front of the cabin. The mussel shells would cut our feet if we stepped on them, running into the lake. We dumped them into a plastic kiddie pool that had crack in it that no one had gotten around to throwing away. One of the adults must have been tossing them away when they got dried out, because every morning the kiddie pool was either empty or almost empty. That's how I spent my 2-week vacation with my cousins. We ran about in the way only children could, screaming and causing problems. We ate nothing but junk food, and at night, being so tired from our daily chaos, we slept the moment the sun went down. I had wished my entire life could be just that, napping whenever and eating whenever. No homework or any kind of responsibilities, but all good things come to an end. The night before we were set to leave, my cousins thought it was a good idea to let me watch my first horror movie beyond a PG-13 rating. It was some slasher film I still haven't found the name of. Low budget and poorly made. But when you're young, everything is real to me. The slasher was killing people in the woods in the movie, and our cabin was surrounded by woods. For the rest of the day, I refused to look at the trees, fearing I would see a dark figure of a man holding a bloody knife, waiting for me and my family. My mother was angry at us for watching such a movie, but in a way glad for it. Some pets had gone missing, and on the other side of the lake, a little girl had gone missing the first week we arrived. It was something she didn't tell us until years later, but she thought if we were scared of the woods, we wouldn't go out at night. At least not until they found out what that wild animal was responsible for the missing pet and the girl. I was in bed sharing a room with my cousin, who was dead asleep. The fear of the slasher in the woods and the fear of having to go home the next day kept me awake. No matter how hard I tried to sleep, I just couldn't. The hours passed and I finally gave up. It was muggy in the room and I kicked off my thin sheets and went to the window to crack it open and get some fresh air. We kept it closed because the screen had fallen out and there was nothing to keep the bugs out. I thought a few minutes wouldn't do much harm. I looked out, shuddering at the sight of the trees in the dark. Low rumbling in the distance signaled a storm coming. My mother did say it would storm and cool down for tomorrow. The rain might help with the muggy heat, but sometimes it just gets muggier after a storm. I sighed, feeling a slight breeze on my face. I didn't want to go back home. I wanted to stay at the cabin, slash a killer in the forest and all. I was about to close the window when another breeze came. A stronger one, carrying a ghastly smell. A rotting fish smell. The first day there we caught a fish. A small one on a rocky edge of the lake. We tried to release it back into the lake, but it jumped out of my cousin's hand, and between rocks we couldn't reach. The sight was funny at first, but the third day, the stench was so bad, we didn't go fishing there again. It was like that smell, but as if 100 fish had died. My toes almost curled from the smell. It was a wonder my cousin didn't wake up from the stench drifting up. After the smell came the sound, a soft crunching, a sound that made my skin prickle in fear. I'd never heard anything like it before. Maybe like how a dog chews away on a bone. Teeth on something hard, biting and chewing away. It scared me, sure, but it was so weird I had to look down and around trying to figure out what on earth was going on. That was when I saw it. Under the windows was our kiddie pool we had filled up with mussels one last time. A dark figure I couldn't make out, hunched over the pile, grabbing at the mussels, then shoving them to its mouth. It was so dark, I could only make it out as some sort of looked human-shaped, and it looked wet. I leaned out the window a little more, trying to get a better look. Whoever it was must have heard me, and its head turned around mid-grab to stare up at me. Thunder rumbled louder as I stared down at the face of a monster. Yellow eyes glowed in dark, empty-looking eye sockets. Face so dark and black I couldn't make out the features, but I could make out the rows and rows of teeth when it opened its mouth to shove another handful of muscles in and crunched away at them. I froze, unable to believe what I was seeing. It didn't seem real. A slasher killer was believable because that was just a person stalking others in the dark. I'd never believed in monsters or ghouls. Even at the gullible age I was oddly grown up when it came to such subjects. And yet, I was looking down at a monster. It stared at me, never breaking eye contact. While still looking up at me and its mouth wide and smiling, it started to walk towards the cabin. It was on the second floor, and our first floor doors locked. If it got inside, my uncle and aunt had camped out in the living room for the night. They could stop it, or at least slow it down if it got inside the cabin. I felt safe for a few seconds, listening to wet footsteps from the ground below. But that feeling faded when the creature reached a webbed clawed hand into the cabin and started to pull itself up. Yellow eyes still staring, teeth still smiling. So slowly, it crept closer to me, climbing the side of the cabin. Each time its hand hit the side of the cabin to pull itself up, I could hear a sickening wet slapping. I should have screamed. I should have woken up my cousin. I should have just shut the window, but my body had just shut down. I couldn't move. I could only watch as the thing got closer and listen to the rumbles of thunder threatening a storm. The smell was getting worse as it crept ever closer. My heart was beating so fast, I started to get dizzy and my vision started to fade. I willed myself to move from the window, but nothing of myself would move. I couldn't pull myself away from the sight. As the creature climbed, I could hear it. It was making a sound that haunted my nightmares ever since. A low, excited exhale of breath. Closer it got until it wanted. I could reach out and touch it. I could make out its face a bit better. It was flat and as dark as the night, no nose to speak of, just those horrible eyes and teeth. I felt the clawed hands come into the window sill right next to mine. The fish smell almost overpowered the rest of my senses, but I could still hear that awful sound as it opened its mouth right in front of my face. I was staring down, directly down its throat, ready to have my face bitten off by those countless teeth. A crash of thunder shook the cabin. It was so sudden, I was snapped out of my trance. I screamed and fell back as the world went white, blinding my vision. I grabbed the window and slammed it down, finding no clawed hands on the sill. I still saw the top of the creature's head, but it didn't stick around. I ran screaming from the room, and right next door, banging on it, begging someone to come and save me. Soon, the entire cabin was awake, and I just sat in the hallway sobbing about a monster. No one took me seriously. My cousin was very upset I had woken up. Everyone blamed the storm for suddenly scaring me awake or giving me nightmares. I still refused to go back to that room. I stayed in the living room with my aunt and uncle. I almost settled down after they blocked all the doors with chairs. At least they were humouring me that much. I was so stressed out, I didn't even think about the first floor windows. For the rest of the night, I stayed awake, listening to the storm, but I swore between the thunder I heard the excited sound. I never really spoke about this to my family. I went about my life, but any time a storm rolls in, I'm forced to relieve those few minutes. I've kept an eye on the news in the area where the cabin is. It's been pretty normal until recently. Now, a boy and girl are missing. I have a feeling more are going to go missing if someone doesn't do something. I have money saved, so I decided to go back to that area. I can't rent the same cabin we stayed in, but I'm going back to the lake to see if I can find anything. I don't know why that monster didn't eat me that night. Maybe it was so full I wasn't worth the trouble. But if I can't do anything to protect this area, please lock your doors. Keep your windows shut and pets inside. And if you hear strange noises outside, don't look. I'm 16 years old, and I've lived in the same neighbourhood since I was around 6 or 7. It's a nice place. There isn't really a problem with the neighbours, and we all get along, but where we live, there's like 5 houses, 3 in a row, and 2 across, just behind the ones across. and it's an abandoned place. There's two small buildings, they both seem to be burned down, and they have been like that even before we moved there. No one really lives there. There's like a wood fence, I don't know what it's called, and it has holes on the bottom, and for some reason, no dog likes to cross over to the side. And if they do, at night, you can hear them barking as if asking for help. And if they come back, they most of the time aren't the same. When I was around 10, my mom's friend lived on one of the houses that were across, and she had kids around our age, my siblings and I, and we got along very well. One night, we were on a trampoline. It was my younger brother, 8 at the time, my younger sister, 6 at the time, and one of my mom's friend's daughters, 9 at the time. And we were alone since our parents had gone out to a bar and had left us with my older sister, an oldest daughter of my mum's friend. They were both the same age, 16. Well, we were tossing around a ball when one of us threw it too hard and it went to the other side. And since it was dark, none of us dared to go to get it. But as kids, we were like, oh, I bet you won't ask if there's anyone, can we have the ball back? And eventually one of us did after a while of waiting. We decided to just go inside when we were all at the staircase. We heard a noise, but the front light wasn't very bright and we didn't see anything until it got close to us. We saw the ball. Yes. That same one that went to the other side. We had no idea of what to do, so we ran inside and decided not to tell anyone anything, thinking they would make fun of us. Well, as the years went by, none of us told anyone until I was around 12 and my mum's friend had moved. We told our cousin and some of my brother's friends about that place and how we sometimes would see a shadow running around, even though no one dared to go in there. Well, at the time, we also had new neighbours who had a kid around my age and became our friend. Their house was right in front of a big opening to the other side, so one day we planned to go to the other side. Keep in mind, that was the first time in there, so we had no idea what to expect. Well, at that time, it was my cousin, my brother, my brother's friend's brother, and our neighbour's friend. My cousin and I were the only girls and the rest were guys, so they decided to go in first. There was this building that was made out of cement bricks that was half destroyed and in pieces, and the other half just seemed very old. There were so many toys, some in bags and some just there. Behind it, it was just empty. Old grass and nothing else, but what seemed to be toilet paper all over the dead plants. In front, there was a small room, also made of cement, but this one had windows and was yellow. It was more of a small house with 2 rooms. One of the windows was broken, but there were 3. The other 2 were untouched. Everyone except me decided to go and explore deep inside the place and the houses. I decided to stay near the entrance to our neighbourhood. I was just walking around trying not to go in too far, when I suddenly noticed something on the floor, and I reached out to it. I was surprised by what it was. It was a picture of what seemed like a family. It was a very pretty lady, a little girl and a man. And in the background, you could see this exact same place, just not destroyed. The picture seemed very old, and it was all folded with marks. I called over the guys and my cousin, and when they came, I showed them the picture. We just stared at it for a while when we realised that it was in the back of the lady, there was a figure, like a man or a shadow. And for some reason, when I saw it, I dropped the picture, and to this day, I don't remember very well. But for some reason, something tells me that I dropped it because I felt it burn. And something tells me that if that's true, it may be because that was how the place got destroyed. As if I'd been there, but I'm not too sure, but going back. When I dropped the photo, we heard a noise of a glass that had been shattered, and of course, there was only one place that had glass, which was the yellow house. My brother and friend ran into it and screamed. Our reaction was to go and check on them. When we got there, we ran without looking back. We went to my house. Turns out that we got there, one of the 2 windows was broken, and on the floor there was something written, "Get out of here." And it was written with what seemed like blood. After that time, we never dared to go back in, but even to this day, we still see and hear things. Like one time when it was dark, my older brother and I were outside waiting for his girlfriend. There was no one in the home, but the rest were over at my aunt's house, and suddenly we heard a scream so similar to my younger brother's voice coming from that place. But at that time, he was in Mexico. Truth is, ever since we decided to go into that place, things felt very different now. 4 years later, I still wonder about this picture, and I know my story sounded so unreal. Sometimes when we talk about it, even we can't believe it. But we were there. Okay, if you sleep in room A and you can see the stairs and the door of room C, one day my mum saw a man figure that looked at her and then went downstairs. She couldn't say anything at the moment, but then she thought it was a boy that my sister and I sneaked. She goes to our rooms. I was in room B and my sister was in room C, but we were sleeping. Later one day I was alone in the house. We had a dog and he started barking at room C, so I went there and saw nothing. It was in daylight. Then by this time, because this thing does not have a pattern, my brother moved to room C, which was empty since my sister moved out. He moved there with his wife and baby for a few months. One day, they were chatting in the living room downstairs and just listened to the monitor of the baby. Just sound, no image. That one of the toys turned on. The kind of toys that you move and lights and sounds turn on. So they go upstairs and see that the baby is still sleeping, and the toy is not even needed, the baby. Also, I need to clarify that a lot of people, I have 2 brothers and 1 sister, have been living there for a few weeks or months with their partners and kids. It's not a big house, but we have a lot of space. Till this moment, I haven't really seen the thing. One day, I was in the TV room. If you sit there, you can see the beginning of the stairs and part of the kitchen. In a house very open with everything connected with no doors, so the first floor is a big thing with few separations. Okay, so I was there watching TV, and then I saw someone coming down the stairs and going into the kitchen. I waited to see the light of the kitchen turn on or see someone crossing the kitchen, but no one was there. This is the first time I saw it with my own eyes. At this time, I had this boyfriend coming over. He was helping me cook something, and I was in the TV room choosing something to watch, and he says, "I saw you." And I was like, "Not in the kitchen." So I went there and asked what he was talking about. So he explained to me that he saw someone walking behind him exactly in the path that I saw this thing walking. It's the same every time. End of the stairs, walks down, and then to the kitchen. Later, a cousin of my sister-in-law was visiting the city, so she came over and refused to sleep in the house because she stated that there was something there. These stories took place from 2005 to 2015, but again in 2020 and 2021, when COVID was in the strongest phase. My dad got sick, and by this time at the house, only my parents, myself, and my daughter lived there. Since he was really sick, attached to oxygen, my mom and he slept in the TV room. One night, both of them saw this thing, this figure, walking the same path I saw before. This ghost, spirit thing has never hurt us, but it doesn't have a pattern. But it looks like the Hat Man and is shadow-like.